Good morning. This is going to be the last video covering Unit 9, talking about the cycling of energy and matter. And there's going to be a lot of new words that we're going to be talking about, but a lot of familiar ones. So when we're talking about the cycling of energy and matter, it has to do with inside of an ecosystem, and a lot of it has to do with photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Now, before we dive too deep, we need to first understand what exactly is energy and what exactly is matter. Energy is just how much work or change that can really be done, okay? But matter is a substance that everything is made of. So when we're talking about matter right here, if you have a solid, like let's say ice, okay, and you apply energy and you increase the energy right here, you see how the energy is increasing. Eventually these things are going to change because energy is changing the matter. So this ice turns into water, and the water turns into vapor because the energy is increasing inside each one of these states of matter. And as the energy increases, that causes change or work to happen, which changes the matter itself, the nature of the matter itself. Now, the first thing we need to understand is that cells absolutely need energy. Now, a lot of different things are using energy within a cell. And probably the best example is active transport that we were talking about earlier, where you have the transport of molecules inside the cell, and what they do is they actually require ATP. Now, I know I talked a little bit about ATP, but ATP is energy, just a refresher. And what's really cool is this is actually a picture of ATP, the molecules of ATP right now. And what it does is, see these little P's? Those are phosphorus at the very end. And what happens is it basically breaks apart the phosphorus and causes like an explosion of energy whenever the cell actually needs the energy. So it stores it until it needs it, and then it starts breaking apart those bonds, releasing all that energy. Now, an important concept that we just talked about a little bit is that cells get energy from food, and food contains chemical energy. In other words, this is a glucose molecule right here. This picture is a glucose molecule. And these right here are actually carbon atoms, oxygen atoms, and hydrogen atoms. And all these atoms are bonded together by these bonds in between each atom. And these bonds are just the little lines right here. Now these bonds actually have a ton of energy inside of them. So what happens is whenever a cell wants to break apart this glucose molecule, when it does, it actually creates an explosion of energy by breaking apart these bonds. And the same thing is happening whenever you have ATP. It is a way that the cell can store energy by storing it in these little bonds between the phosphorus, that P atom right here, and then whenever it needs the energy, it just breaks it apart. So, cells need energy, and the food, like glucose, is a molecule, and all molecules have energy stored in them. And what the cell does is it breaks apart this glucose molecule, and it might use it for energy right then and there, or it stores it as ATP and uses it later. Now, we've been talking about how molecules can actually store energy. So this little molecule that I'm drawing with two atoms, it has energy stored inside of the bonds between them. And then whenever it breaks, it releases that energy. Now, it's really important that you understand that energy and matter, they don't just poof, disappear, okay? They just change form. They never, ever, ever, ever are destroyed. They just change form. And this is called the law of conservation. So if you look at this atom that we just draw, it doesn't just release the energy and disappear. The energy turns into something else, like heat or light or something. Now, a good example of the law of conservation is when you have electrical energy from the socket in your house, okay? And that electrical energy goes through and it's turned into thermal energy from the heater. And, you know, during the cold winter and all that electrical energy is being transformed into thermal energy. The electrical energy just doesn't disappear, it's being, you know, transformed, okay? So matter is the same way. Matter is never destroyed, okay? All it does is just change form. So if you have an ice cube right here, this ice cube, it doesn't disappear, it melts and turns into water. And the cool thing is there is the exact same amount of molecules of water as there is of ice. So this one has 400 atoms. This one's going to have 400 atoms. Now, before we move on, we're going to be talking about photosynthesis and then cellular respiration. But before we really dive into those, you really need to understand some basic chemistry and how scientists use kind of this notation whenever they're writing out reactions between atoms and molecules. Now, this reaction right here is talking about how you make water, H2O. You have a hydrogen, which is represented by this H, and the oxygen is represented by O. So in this case, let's take a look at this oxygen right here. Now there's no number in front of it like you have with the 2 and the H, so we're going to assume that there's a 1 there. Now this right here is kind of how you break it down. You have one oxygen molecule, but the oxygen molecule has 2 atoms in it. So this oxygen molecule, it actually looks something like this. You have an atom and an atom, and inside the atom, I'm sorry, the atoms are oxygen, and I'm inside the atom, I'm going to put the word O, the letter O, so you know it's an oxygen. If you take a look over here, you have 2H2 right here. So in this 2H2, you have 2 hydrogen molecules, but only one of each, I'm sorry, 2 of each hydrogen atoms. So H2 is going to look like this, where you have H and H, but remember there is a 2 in front of it, which means that you really have 2 of these molecules floating around. So for every 2 of these hydrogen molecules, you have 1 oxygen molecule. And whenever all these 3 molecules right here combine, you're going to get H2O. And H2O is written you have 2 H's, okay? And those 2 H's, what they're going to do is they're going to attach to the oxygen just like that. And remember, there are 2 of these. So let's put the parentheses in the front and put a 2. Now, we're going to be talking about photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis, we've already talked a little bit before. I'm sure you guys know it's when plants use light energy, and they create carbon dioxide, water, oxygen, and glucose. Okay? So this plant is creating energy by using light, carbon dioxide, and water, making oxygen and glucose. So the way it does it is actually these little bitty things called chlorophyll, and I'm sorry, chloroplasts, and these little organelles that are inside the plant cells, they contain a pigment which is called chlorophyll. So chloroplast is the organelle, and then chlorophyll is just the pigment inside of the organelle, okay? So what happens is as light comes down and hits the plant's going to actually absorb that light energy, and it's going to use the light energy for a reaction right here, where you have the reactants right here. It takes in this carbon dioxide, so it's taking in the carbon dioxide inside the plant, and you can see that right here is a reactant, and then it takes in water inside the plant, and then it's going to produce glucose, which is this long kind of complicated formula, and it's also going to release oxygen. Now, what it does is it keeps the glucose inside because it can use that later to make energy in ATP. But it releases the oxygen into the atmosphere. So, when we're talking about the reactants, your reactants are going to be carbon dioxide and water. But your products, when we're talking about photosynthesis, is going to be glucose and oxygen. So, without plants, we wouldn't have any oxygen floating around in the air for us to breathe. Now, carbon dioxide and all, there's no numbers in front of any of these. So, and that's because just for simplicity. But if you look right here, see how this glucose has 6 carbons? Right there in that long, big, long chain. That's kind of what glucose looks like. It's going to have all these molecules, and it's going to be kind of a complicated mess of atoms, right? But I know there's 6 carbons in here. And remember, matter is not just created out of nowhere, so it has to get the 6 carbons from somewhere, right? So that's why I'm going to put ooh, that's a bad looking 6. That's why I'm going to put a 6 in front of this carbon. Now this is where you start getting into the 8th grade stuff, but because there are 6 carbons in the reactants, that means there's going to be 6 carbons in the products. Now that we talked a little bit about photosynthesis, we're going to be talking about more cellular respiration. And I know we've already covered all this, but really it's important that you understand exactly what's going on with the chemistry of all this. So whenever we use cellular respirations, we are breathing in oxygen and breathing out CO2, okay? Now, we are also using glucose to make that energy that we use, and that is ATP. And all that happens inside mitochondria. So if there's 2 organelles that you're going to learn and that you should know and that every adult knows, it's chloroplasts and mitochondria. Because both chloroplasts and mitochondria, they are what is making energy for the cells. Now, this little formula that for cellular respiration might look a little bit familiar. I mean, you have glucose and oxygen, carbon dioxide and water. It's a lot like photosynthesis, except it's almost backwards, right? In the reactants, our reactants that we use to make energy, we are using sugar or glucose, and we are using oxygen. And then we produce carbon dioxide and water and ATP, which is energy. So our reactants are going to be glucose and oxygen, but the products are going to be carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Now, you might have noticed this, but photosynthesis and cellular respiration are basically opposites of each other. So whenever you have photosynthesis, it makes oxygen and it makes glucose. And guess what? We use oxygen and we use glucose. So whenever we use that stuff, we are going to make our energy, which is going to be ATP. I know you can't see it because of the video, but it's right here. But we are going to use the oxygen and we're going to use the glucose that's made from photosynthesis in our mitochondria, and we're going to make carbon dioxide and water whenever we breathe out. And that carbon dioxide and water is going to be used by plants in photosynthesis, and they're going to make oxygen and glucose. And you can kind of see it's just this whole circle where one is using the other's reactants. So, and remember, reactants are over here. I already have it listed. Reactants are what is being used. Products is what you make. So in photosynthesis, it's using these things and producing these things. And the complete opposite for cellular respiration. Now, this is in case you might like it, to where it shows it as a formula instead of that kind of circular graphic that I made. But in the first one, this first equation is photosynthesis. The second one is cellular respiration. Now, whenever we're talking about this, the reactants for one is the products for another. So, in photosynthesis, the reactants over here are going to be carbon dioxide and H2O. And they use light energy, and they use those chloroplasts to make glucose and oxygen. And we're going to use the glucose and oxygen as our reactants, to where when we use glucose and oxygen, we are going to produce carbon dioxide and water. And those, our products, are going to be used as photosynthesis is the reaction. One last time, just hammering it home, you have glucose over here when we're talking about photosynthesis, and that's going to be the reactants. You can't see that? This is going to be the reactants. This is going to be the products. And you can almost split it right down the middle, where this side over here is going to be reactants, and this side is going to be products. Products. Now, this photosynthesis versus cellular respiration, we kind of learned they're basically opposites of each other. Now, plants and animals, they store and they use energy in different ways. And we kind of talked about this at the beginning of the school year, these nucleic acids, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, right? Now, plants are going to store their energy as glucose, which is actually a carbohydrate. Animals are going to store their energy as lipids, and that's right over here. And what happens is they're going to store it inside of them. So if you got, Bob, he's going to store all of his energy as lipids in fat. And when he needs the lipids to, run, he's going to release ATP. He's going to make ATP out of the lipids, and that's going to turn into energy. Now, we're going to be talking about exactly how matter and energy move around inside of an ecosystem. And a lot of this has to do with photosynthesis and cellular respiration, which we've already learned about. But really the most important thing you need to know is that ecosystems, they don't really have clear boundaries, right? So matter and energy are just freely exchanged within the ecosystem and beyond it and outside of it in the whole world, right? And because energy and matter is not created or destroyed, okay? It's just recycled, reused, transformed into something else. It's constantly moving around and shifting inside the energy, inside the ecosphere, ecosystems, and biosphere. Now, just a really quick review, but all three of these get building materials, in other words, molecules, sugars, fats, stuff like that, from their environment, okay? Producers get energy from the sun, okay, plants. Consumers get energy from other organisms, and decomposers, they break down all the other organisms and they basically recycle it back into the environment. Now you look over here, you have more energy, like, think about it. The sun has a ton of energy, right? And a little bit less goes to the producers, and a little bit less goes to them and to them and them, because we already kind of talked about this. You can't eat the whole thing, or maybe you lose some of the energy due to heat inside of the grasshopper, or you lose a little bit of energy just because not all of it is digestible. So energy is going to be entering the ecosystem as sunlight right here. And that sunlight is going to be entering into the producers. Now, producers like grass and stuff like that are going to be eaten by primary consumers. In other words, herbivores. So primary consumers are going to be herbivores. Now, a lot of people got messed up whenever we start talking about wolves, but a secondary consumer is any kind of carnivore that just eats herbivores. So in this case, we're talking about a mouse eating a grasshopper, and because he eats the primary consumer, this herbivore, he's considered a secondary consumer. And then finally, you have the tertiary consumer. In other words, this is the top predator. It eats all the other kind of carnivores that are eating the herbivores. Now, before we continue on, it's important to distinguish between closed systems and open systems. Now, in an open system, right here, is whenever you have matter and energy, and they can just freely go in and out of the system. Doesn't matter, nothing's holding them back. So in an environment like this desert right here, you have energy from the sun coming in to it, but you also have matter like dust and sand that's being blown around, and this actually might leave the system, or maybe, an organism like a lizard, he decides to leave the desert and go somewhere else. But whenever you have a closed system, that means that matter, in the case of, let's say, the Earth, right here, the matter is not going in and out, okay? So if we have matter, it is not going in and out. So we're going to big old X on that, because matter does not go in and out of a closed system. But it turns out that energy does within a closed system. So in this case, you have the sun, and energy is coming in, but matter isn't. Now there's one more, just in case you guys are confused, and that's going to be an isolated system. That means that nothing comes in or out. Not matter, not energy, nothing. So in case you're a little confused why the closed system has energy coming in and out, but an isolated system is where nothing does. Now, what we're really going to be talking about for the bulk of Unit 9 is the kind of the life support system of the Earth. In other words, how this energy and matter are cycled around and going from one place to another inside the Earth. Because all these organisms need these atoms to live. Hydrogen, sulfur, oxygen, carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, all those are really essential for any kind of life. About all of them, we're only going to be talking about the carbon cycle right here, the nitrogen cycle, and the water cycle. Now, the water cycle is the pathway that water moves around on the Earth. You have clouds up here in this video, and those clouds, they rain, and they drop the rain down, and that rain ends up going down to the plants, and so on and so on and so on. But they're going to be moving through these terms that we're going to learn: precipitation, transpiration, evaporation, and actually one more. So the water cycle right here, let's start with evaporation. Okay, if you have an ocean, and if you look right here, you have your ocean right here. Evaporation is whenever water is taken from a liquid form and it's turned into a steam or a vapor form, like boiling of water. So this evaporation of the ocean and from lakes eventually comes up into the clouds in the atmosphere. And that brings us to, I'm sorry I'm skipping here, but the third one, condensation. Now, condensation is whenever you have this vapor inside the atmosphere and that condenses, condensation, into kind of a liquid form, which is going to be clouds. Now, clouds are a mixture of vapor and liquid, and they're suspended high up in the atmosphere. But whenever there's too much liquid in the clouds, they do something called precipitation, which is this number 4, where precipitation is any kind of rain, snow, hail, anything where water falls out of the sky. And then finally, you have transpiration, which is actually what happens whenever you have plants like these trees. What happens is they can actually lose water from their leaves. And transpiration is whenever you have water that's actually lost from the trees and moving up back into the atmosphere. Next up, you have the carbon cycle. And it's a lot like the water cycle, but we're not going to need as many terms to describe it. But it is still cycling matter, but instead of water, we're cycling carbon. Okay? Now, it's really important that you understand that cellular respiration and photosynthesis are both really linked to the carbon cycle. So whenever you have cellular respiration, you are making CO2 and putting that in the atmosphere. But during photosynthesis, you take in CO2 and that carbon, and it's trapped inside the plants. So we can start actually in the carbon cycle where you have CO2 in the atmosphere right here, and a lot of different stuff might be putting CO2 into the atmosphere. So let's say human industry, like fossil fuels, cars, anything like that. They're combusting fuels. You have photosynthesis, which is actually taking out, I'm sorry that arrow's back, but it is actually taking out carbon dioxide. Okay, so ignore that arrow. And then finally, you have land animals, and they are actually putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And what happens is you have death and decay of these animals and plants, and eventually they get trapped in the ground, and those death and decay, it causes them eventually over a really long period of time turn into fossil fuels. So in other words, carbon is going to be stuck in about 5 different major areas. They're going to be Carbon's going to be trapped in any kind of organism, living or dead. It's going to be trapped in the atmosphere, inside the organic matter in the soil, like decaying and bacteria and all that kind of stuff, inside fossil fuels underneath the earth, or maybe in rock deposits, and then also in oceans as shells, and then the CO2 that's actually dissolved inside the ocean itself. Last up, you have the nitrogen cycle. And this is actually probably one of the most interesting ones because In fact, about 80% of our air that we're breathing in right now is nitrogen, okay? But plants, they actually use a ton of nitrogen and they really, really need nitrogen for all their cell processes. So it's also present in a lot of our DNA and proteins. And because plants, they need it so much, it can actually be considered a limiting factor for many ecosystems, okay? And this kind of picture right here, it shows the the nitrogen cycle, but it kind of goes into really a lot more depth than we need to. Now that's basically it. We were talking about the carbon cycle, and you have CO2 and how that cycles around, and it has the big part with photosynthesis and cellular respiration. We're talking about CO2. And then next up, we talked a little bit about the water cycle, where you have water and it's cycling around, and it's basically changing forms because matter's never created or destroyed because of the laws of conservation. Because water is cycling on all these forms, the transpiration, precipitation, evaporation, condensation. And remember, this prefix of ion means process. So transpiration, precipitation is the process, okay? And then finally, we were talking about the nitrogen cycle and how you have nitrogen in the air is unusable by most of the things. But what happens is it gets fixed by, let's say, lightning or, bacteria in the ground, And what they do is they turn this nitrogen in the air into something usable that plants can grow. And that's about it.